Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you send us and, well, we dive deep to pull out the insights you're looking for.
And today we're getting into a really interesting conversation featuring Richard Dawkins.
That's right. You sent over the transcript from The Poetry of Reality with Richard Dawkins on YouTube specifically, him talking with Alex O'Connor in Oxford.
And it's quite a wide-ranging discussion, isn't it? They cover a lot of ground.
Oh, yeah. Everything from how we might have thought before language to his new book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, and, his views on some current cultural things, too.
So our mission, for you listening, is basically to boil down this pretty extensive chat.
Exactly. We want to pull out the key takeaways, the really thought-provoking bits, maybe the surprising moments, save you some time, but still give you the core of it.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with that idea about thought and language.
Yeah, let's do that. It was right near the beginning. How did he frame that?
Well, he brought up this concept called mentalese. The idea being that even before spoken language, our minds were already structuring thoughts internally.
Mentalese. Like an internal language almost,
Right.
before words.
Sort of, yeah. Like a blueprint for a thought before you actually articulate it. It does make you wonder, doesn't it? Challenges that idea that language created complex thought entirely.
It does. What would that internal thought process have even felt like? He seemed to think human language has a very specific structure, though.
He did. He really focused on the hierarchical nesting of phrases, with the way we can embed clauses within clauses, if-then statements, complex conditions.
Right.
And his point was that this kind of structure, it requires some serious computational power, something maybe unique to us.
And he thought maybe simpler versions came first, internally.
Yeah, he speculated about basic, if I do this, then that happens type scenarios, sort of worked out in the head as maybe a precursor to externalizing it in speech.
Interesting. Okay, so then the conversation kind of shifted gears a bit. Alex O'Connor brought up Dawkins' history, particularly with the God delusion.
Right. O'Connor set the stage, acknowledging Dawkins' huge impact on, the public conversation about atheism over the years.
And that led into something Dawkins has said before, but still catches people off guard sometimes.
The cultural Christian label, yeah.
Which, for arguably the world's most famous atheist, sounds, well, odd.
It does, initially.
Yeah.
But, as O'Connor noted, and as Dawkins himself clarified, it's not about belief at all.
So what is it about for him?
It seems to be about cultural heritage and aesthetic appreciation. He talked about liking the King James Bible's prose, the feel of evensong, even just the sound of church bells.
So it's the traditions, the culture he grew up with in England, not the theology.
Exactly. An affinity for the Anglican tradition's cultural output, completely separate from any belief in God.
Yeah.
It's a nuance, that sometimes gets lost.
Yeah, definitely a distinction worth making. Okay, so moving from that, they then dove into his new book, The Genetic Book of the Dead. That title alone is quite something.
It really is, and the central idea is pretty compelling. He's arguing that we can essentially read an animal's ancestral environment from its genes.
Like a history book written in DNA?
Kind of, yeah, but he uses the metaphor of a palimpsest.
A palimpsest. That's like an old scroll or manuscript that's been written over, but you can still see faint traces of the original text underneath.
Precisely. And Dawkins argues our genes are like that, layered with evolutionary history. The environment of the past leaves its mark.
How so? What are the examples?
Well, camouflage is a really clear one he uses. Think of a desert lizard that looks exactly like the pebbles it lives on.
Okay.
Or butterflies that mimic dead leaves perfectly. Dawkins says that's like the ancestral environment being, painted right onto the animal, a visible record.
And it's not just skin deep, presumably.
No, exactly. He brings in Darwin, emphasizing how natural selection is constantly scrutinizing everything, every tiny variation.
Right. Survival of the fittest, adapted to the environment.
So that intense pressure, that adaptation,
Yeah.
it has to be reflected internally too, not just on the surface. The external perfection hints at this deeper internal record of past worlds shaping the organism now.
Did they talk about other ways this record might show up beyond just looking like the background?
They did. They touched on chemistry. Haldane's old idea about our salty blood perhaps reflecting a marine ancestry. Dawkins admits it might be a bit fanciful, but it illustrates the point.
Any human examples?
Well, he offered one that many of us can probably relate to. Back pain.
Ha!
Could that be a kind of genetic memory?
Yeah.
A relic of our ancestors walking on all fours, with our spines now protesting this relatively recent upright posture?
Makes you think, doesn't it? What other quirks are echoes from the past?
It's a fascinating way to view biology. But it's also important to remember evolution isn't perfect. They discuss that too.
Ah, yes, the evolutionary blunders.
Right. Dawkins quoted John Maynard Smith's line, "Natural selection is bungled again." These apparent flaws actually tell us a lot about how evolution works.
Like that nerve, the one that takes the scenic route.
Exactly, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. In
Hmm.
giraffes, it's just ridiculous. It goes all the way down the neck, loops around an artery near the heart, and then goes all the way back up to the larynx.
Seems incredibly inefficient. And the human eye, too, wasn't that mentioned?
Yeah, the vertebrate retina being wired back to front. The nerve fibers pass in front of the light receptors, partially blocking the light. Mollusks apparently have it the right way around.
So why do these things persist if they're bad design?
Well, take the nerve. The explanation is it's a historical accident. As the neck got longer over evolutionary time, the nerve got stretched along that path. The marginal cost of slightly lengthening the existing path was always less than the huge developmental cost of completely rerouting it.
So evolution is a tinkerer, not an engineer designing from scratch. It works with what's already there.
Precisely. It's constrained by history. The vertebrate eye likely evolved step by step from a simple light-sensitive patch, and each step was advantageous at the time, even if the final design isn't what an engineer would come up with. These blunders are actually evidence for evolution, showing its gradual contingent nature.
Okay, that makes sense. Then the conversation took another turn, looking at how we humans are impacting natural selection now.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. Our societies, caring for people who might not have survived in a purely natural state, that changes the selective pressures.
So it makes it harder to read that genetic book for future generations of humans.
Dawkins acknowledged that, yeah. Because the pressures are now partly cultural, ethical,
Yeah.
driven by compassion, not just raw survival. It might obscure some of the environmental signals in our genes down the line.
But he wasn't arguing against medicine or care, was he?
Oh, absolutely not. He was very clear on that. It's more of an observation about how our values are now actively shaping our own evolutionary trajectory in a way that's, well, unique.
Right. Now, a lot of this discussion, and Dawkins' work generally, relies on the gene-centered view of evolution. That's had its critics, hasn't it?
It has, and they touched on that. Dawkins basically restated the core idea. It's the gene that's the unit of selection, because genes, as information, can potentially last for millions of years, copied from generation to generation.
Whereas individuals, we don't last.
Exactly. Individuals are temporary vehicles. Genes are potentially immortal replicators. He used the analogy of recipes in cookbooks. Organisms are like the meals. Genes are the recipes that get passed on if they're successful.
What about the specific criticisms, like from Dennis Noble?
Right. Noble apparently sees DNA more like a passive library, the cell consults, rather than the active driver. Dawkins pushed back strongly on that.
Also.
He emphasized that genes have a definite causal influence on how bodies develop, and that influence is what affects their own chances of being passed on. He made the point about inheritance. You don't inherit a broken arm, but you do inherit a broken gene. That causal link is crucial.
And didn't he have a kind of provocative description of genes in the book? Something about viruses?
Ah, yes, his sting in the tail. He called genes a gigantic colony of symbiotic viruses.
Wow. Explain that one.
He distinguishes between vertical parasites, ones passed down through sperm and egg, like our genes and mitochondria, and horizontal ones that spread other ways.
Okay.
Vertical parasites, like our genes, share the same fate as the host organism. Their success is tied to the host successfully reproducing. So they have a shared interest in cooperating to build a good vehicle. That's why our genes work together. They all rely on the same escape route, the gametes.
That's a fascinating perspective. To make natural selection clearer, they went over some classic examples too, right? The peppered moth.
Absolutely, a textbook case. During the Industrial Revolution in Britain, soot darkened the trees.
And the dark moths suddenly blended in better while the pale ones stood out to birds.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Bernard Kettlewell's research showed birds selectively eating the more conspicuous moths. So the frequency of the dark form shot up in polluted areas. A direct, visible example of environmental pressure driving selection.
And the mosquitoes in the London Underground.
Yeah, another example of relatively rapid adaptation to a new human-created environment. Evolution happening right under our feet, so to speak.
Then they got on to convergent evolution. I always find this concept so powerful.
Me too. It's when unrelated species independently evolve similar traits because they face similar environmental challenges. It's strong evidence for the power of natural selection.
Australia being the prime example.
Definitely. Marsupials got isolated there and radiated out to fill niches that placental mammals filled elsewhere. So you get a marsupial wolf, the thylacine marsupial moles, mice, and so on. Similar forms, similar lifestyles, but evolved completely separately.
And the mole example wasn't just marsupials versus placentals, was it?
No, he mentioned the African golden mole, too. Looks and acts like a mole, burrows like a mole, but it's actually related to elephants. It evolved the mole lifestyle totally independently from true moles and marsupial moles.
Amazing. And animals going back to the water?
Yeah, whales, turtles, seals,
Mm.
all descendants of land animals that readapted to aquatic life. And tortoises had that incredible double reversal, water to land, back to water as turtles, then back to land again as tortoises.
So reading the genetic book in those cases must be complex.
Very complex, like reading a palimpsest with multiple layers of history, as Dawkins puts it. But fossils and studying the adaptations themselves give us clues.
It's easy to get evolution wrong, though. What did Dawkins say are the biggest misunderstandings people have?
Two main things, really. First, underestimating the sheer time involved. People expect huge changes quickly, but it's incredibly gradual.
Millions and millions of years.
Exactly. Second, thinking it's all just random chance. The variation from mutation is random, yes, but the selection part is the opposite of random. It's a gradual filtering process.
He used his Mount Improbable analogy again.
He did. You can't leap to the top of a complex mountain in one go, but you can walk up a gradual slope. Complex things like eyes evolve step by step, each small step being an improvement, not one giant improbable leap.
What about irreducible complexity? The mousetrap argument.
Dawkins tends to see that as an argument from personal incredulity or just a lack of imagination. He used wing evolution as a counter.
How so?
Well, you don't need a perfect wing from day one. Even a small flap of skin, like on a flying squirrel, gives a gliding advantage. That can then be gradually improved upon over generations, leading eventually to powered flight, like in bats. It's incremental, not all or nothing like the mousetrap suggests.
Okay. Now, Dawkins himself seems to be misunderstood sometimes, that cultural Christian thing again.
Right, he had to clarify. It's purely about cultural familiarity growing up with the Bible, hymns, the Church of England's presence, not, he stressed, any kind of move towards belief.
So the idea that new atheism created a vacuum filled by wokery.
He pushed back on that too. Said he never saw new atheism as some unified project anyway. His goal is just to critique irrationality wherever he sees it.
They also touched briefly on his chats with Jordan Peterson. Sounds like there's still a fundamental difference there.
Very much so. Dawkins described Peterson as seeming drunk on symbols, prioritizing the symbolic meaning over factual accuracy.
The Cain and Abel example.
Yeah. Peterson apparently gave this deep symbolic reading, while Dawkins was trying to ask, well, did it actually happen? He felt Peterson sidestepped factual questions, like about the virgin birth, focusing only on the symbolism, a real clash of approaches.
Interesting. Someone in the audience then connected memes and genes, suggesting maybe surviving religious ideas reflect some kind of ancestral truth in a cultural sense.
Yeah, the mimetic parallel to the genetic book idea.
Hmm.
Dawkins seemed quite receptive to that, actually. Called it a potentially fruitful line of thought.
Did Peterson try to link memes and archetypes?
Apparently so, yes. Linking memes to Jungian archetypes. It's an area where their thinking perhaps overlaps slightly, though likely with different interpretations.
When Dawkins argues against God, what specific concept is he usually addressing?
His main target is the idea of an intelligent creator who designed the universe and its laws. He treats that as a scientific hypothesis, an interesting one, he says, but one he finds unsupported by evidence.
And more abstract definitions.
He tends to challenge those, asking what they actually mean if they don't imply some kind of active intelligence or intervention.
The conversation also got quite personal regarding belief, especially concerning Christopher Hitchens' end of life.
Yes, Dawkins was quite scathing about a book suggesting Hitchens might have turned towards faith. He compared it directly to the old discredited story about Darwin having a deathbed conversion.
And for himself.
He stated emphatically, absolutely zero chance of anything similar happening to him. Very clear on that.
Sounds like there are questions he just doesn't like answering to.
Yes. Do you believe in free will? He gave the Hitchens-esque reply, I have no choice. And also, what advice would you give a young person? Seems he finds that one a bit trite.
Before the audience Q&A, what was his tip for getting ideas across effectively?
His key strategy, he said, is empathy with the audience. putting himself in the reader's or listener's shoes, trying to anticipate how they might misunderstand something, reading his own words as if someone else wrote them.
That's good advice for any communicator. Okay, the Q&A seemed like a rapid-fire round of big topics. Any key highlights?
Definitely. They circled back to why religion might have been useful 5,000 years ago. Dawkins' slightly tongue-in-cheek answer was, because not enough people have read The God Delusion.
Yeah. And more on pre-language thought.
Yeah, elaborating that it might involve things like spatial reasoning, mental maps, imagery, nonverbal ways of processing the world.
What about science's next frontiers?
He speculated about a theory of everything in physics and figuring out the origin of life, though he admitted the origin might remain elusive. And he restated his view that science and supernatural belief are fundamentally incompatible ways of knowing.
And the future of human evolution. AI, genetic engineering.
Big questions there. Are we the end point? Probably not. He talked about the potential for AI to surpass us intellectually, perhaps becoming the inheritors of intelligence on Earth. And genetic engineering, plus even cosmetic surgery, creating a kind of unnatural selection.
Things our ancestors certainly didn't face.
Exactly. Mate selection based on things that aren't necessarily signals of underlying genetic fitness anymore.
What about consciousness? The philosophical zombie idea came up.
It did, and Dawkins basically admitted consciousness's evolutionary purpose is still a profound mystery. He said he doesn't have a pet favorite theory for it.
It's refreshing to hear that level of uncertainty on such a big question. What about his own passion for evolution? Where did that start?
Just a deep fascination, he said, with the sheer complexity and the elegance of living things. The apparent design, which science can explain through natural processes.
Did he mention a favored species from the new book?
He did. The dancing lemur, Propithecus velocifaca. He seemed quite taken with its unique way of moving.
And the most exciting area of current evolutionary research for him.
DNA sequencing, definitely. Mapping the tree of life with ever-increasing detail, uncovering the relationships between all living things.
The Q&A also touched on morality. Is the world getting morally better or worse?
Dawkins referenced Steven Pinker's work, suggesting that historically things have generally improved morally, despite current perceptions.
And where does morality come from in his view? Not religion.
No, he argued religion is often a poor basis, pointing to questionable morals in sacred texts. He sees morality more as an evolutionary construct, refined by philosophical thought, perhaps grounded in something like the Golden Rule, or minimizing suffering.
Is minimizing suffering his go-to axiom?
He seemed to lean towards that, yes, focusing on sentient beings as the benchmark, though acknowledging the difficulty in establishing universal metrics.
AI came up again, too, in terms of scientific discovery.
Yes, things like AlphaFold solving protein folding AI tackling problems humans couldn't. He sees huge potential there.
What does he find the hardest objection to his views?
He mentioned the fine-tuning argument, the idea that the universe's physical constants seem perfectly set for life. His responses tend towards the multiverse hypothesis, or arguing that invoking a creator just pushes the problem back one step.
And finally, that thought experiment about the last religious believer.
Right. He contrasted the hypothetical loss of that last believer with the actual loss of a language or a species. For him, the loss of knowledge about the natural world feels more significant than the disappearance of a belief system he considers unfounded.
Well, that was certainly a deep dive. It's incredible how much ground they covered in that conversation with Richard Dawkins, from the intricacies of evolutionary biology to the big questions about consciousness and the future.
Absolutely. And by pulling out these key insights and connecting them for you, we hope we've saved you a good deal of time while still providing a thorough understanding of the main points and the fascinating ideas discussed.
So for a final thought for you today, considering Dawkins' perspective on the evolutionary history embedded within our genes and the ongoing evolution of culture and ideas, what do you think are the most enduring legacies we leave behind, both biologically and conceptually? Something to ponder. Until next time on The Deep Dive.